everybody. Thank you very much for inviting me today to speak to you. And it would have been so much better to have kind of met everybody in person. But I think we've all got used to sort of, Zooming and teaming all the time and worrying about what's in the background behind us on our walls. I'm Ranjana. I'm very happy to be here with you, although virtually today. And I'm going to talk to you about particularly the impacts of COVID-19 on perinatal mental health and this rapid digital pivot as services have moved online. And I'm going to present very early thoughts from my own little project with people who are pregnant and new mothers. In this particular context. And it's very early because I've literally just finished the interviews and the transcripts haven't arrived for the interviews. So I have by no means analyzed the data yet, but I can present to you some very initial thoughts from having spoken to these women. And my background is that I have researched perinatal mental health and particularly the role of digital technologies for the last 5 years in my capacity as an academic who works within sort of media and communications and sociology. So when I found myself in lockdown with a little baby myself, and thank COVID was very much here when I had my 6-week check, I couldn't not sort of put life and work together and kind of take on this new project just to kind of make raising an infant in a pandemic a little bit more complicated for myself by taking on new research. But here I am, and I hope these very, very prelim thoughts will be of use to you. And findings, as I said, are likely to develop further and a report is likely to emerge. Okay, so I'm going to talk about COVID-19 perinatal mental health and the digital pivot as services have moved online. And as societies across the world, as we've sort of started relying on technology more than ever before. I mean, we were already very reliant on technology, but now more than ever before. And sort of what are the implications in the context of supporting new mothers? So I think it's very clear that COVID-19 stands to impact perinatal mental health disproportionately, and these disproportionate impacts on pregnancy and maternity, for instance, are already being noticed by everybody who works in the sector. The Women's Inequality Select Committee in the UK Parliament are actively looking for evidence of disproportionate impact, and that includes pregnancy and maternity. So I think it's clear to everybody in the sector that this particular period, the perinatal period, and the period with a new baby is rendered even more complex and difficult with the circumstances around COVID-19, particularly the lockdown and the social distancing. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to present to you these emergent findings from a qualitative project with 14 perinatal women that I recently conducted, where I interviewed face-to-face, in-depth women with very, very little babies amidst the lockdown and people who were about to give birth. And I hope that gives us something to think about, not just about these disproportionate impacts, but also about services, particularly the role of technology in the process and the ways in which we need to kind of really complexify and complicate the way we look at technology and the limits sometimes of what technology can achieve and how we can make technology work for us in this context. Okay, so I've got the list of women here, and as you will see, the vast majority had very, very little babies. So I spoke to 14 women from across England. One of the advantages of doing fieldwork online is that you can speak to people from anywhere and you don't actually have to travel to these people, which I couldn't have done with a tiny baby myself. 11 women had babies between 4 weeks to 4 months, and 3 were pregnant in the 3rd trimester. 4 out of the 14 were from South Asian backgrounds. 6 out of the 14 had diagnosed mental health difficulties. And there was a very wide variation in accessing digital support. Some were completely unaware of things that existed and completely disconnected. Others were using social support and social media in terms of informal connections, like connecting to friends and family. And some were actively being supported remotely by healthcare professionals, including perinatal mental health services. So we've got that wide spectrum, not just in terms of life circumstances, but also in terms of the ways in which technology was being used to cope with the lockdown and cope with COVID-19 in the perinatal period. So I wanted to talk first about the disproportionate impact that I've talked about on perinatal mental health. 6 key lines of disproportionate impacts. First of all, there's evidence that's emerging from the OECD, from the United Nations, from the United Kingdom, particularly in the Crisis Collides report recently, that women are by far disproportionately affected by COVID. So there's a real gender disbalance in terms of COVID impacts in loads of different ways. But just one of those different ways is the question of domestic labor and unpaid work, the care work at home, and the ways in which that is gendered, and the ways in which women sometimes pay the price by taking on a huge amount of that. So what happens if you're doing that with a baby, or often with a baby and an existing toddler or a preschooler, when gender is very significantly impacting the amount of load that is on you. So, for instance, Trisha tells me about her partner. He wasn't very hands-on. I mean, that's why when she was born, I relied on parents and in-laws so much more. It caused so many arguments initially, and he just couldn't seem to get his head around. He'd be coming home from work during lockdown and saying, "Why are you so miserable? Why are you crying all the time? Why don't you just smile? What's wrong with you?" And it's very hard to point fingers, but in this particular context, the partner had very, very demanding work circumstances, and he wasn't allowed to be furloughed or allowed to work from home. And that really complicated things. And in other cases, partners just weren't supportive enough. But whatever the circumstances, Trisha is one of the many women who were doing the dual shift, the triple shift amidst lockdown, completely cut off with a tiny baby. And that generates enormously difficult circumstances. At this point, I have to say, if you hear my dog barking or my baby screaming, that just is the lockdown. And they are all at home, and they are probably going to make noise anyway. The second line of disproportionate impact is that face-to-face perinatal support services, which we know have already been stretched and funding has already been a significant issue. A lot of these services have now been diverted. So many mothers spoke about, "Oh, I rang for support, but I was told that support has been diverted." Or, "I rang for support and I was told that I would get a call back, but that never happened. But, oh, that must be because of this." But also the social distancing practices and the new practices, as we've seen from RCO, GRRCOM coming up about new practices of birthing and the presence of birth partners on wards, the difficulty with 6-week checks, the difficulty with postnatal checks. So social distancing and the diversion of support has actually really been felt by mothers in terms of asking for support and not finding it, and sometimes not even asking because of that sense of why bother. Almost everybody I spoke to was in one of these two categories, that they've asked for support and not found it, or been told that things have been diverted, or been told wait for a call back and that's not happened, or they felt like, what's the point in asking? Third, informal perinatal support, for instance, groups and coffees and local meetups and family support have all been cut off owing to social distancing, and we know this. There's not the chance to go and have a coffee with someone, or to go and have lunch with someone, or to talk to someone about difficulties or anything else that's going on, simply because everybody is also coping with lockdown, and everybody is kind of surrounded by kids and partners and everybody at home in any case. But also things like baby groups and baby massage classes and anything else, postnatal exercise classes have all been shut down, and that has been a drastic change. And my new shoes are a very good example in which I felt it myself, because I bought shoes to join a mum and baby Pilates class, and those shoes they've not been used. They've been used for my walks in the woods, which are very nice, but nonetheless, that's not what they were bought for. So that's one of the many impacts of the informal support networks being cut off. A recent Lancet paper outlines that COVID-19 impacts on mental health is going to be huge and enormous, and many perinatal women had existing difficulties with well-being, some diagnosed, some not diagnosed. So the question of pre-existing impacts, kind of on top of which there is the perinatal and on top of which there's the pandemic, generates a three-layered sandwich that would overwhelm numerous people. So it's not a surprise if somebody with a new baby is significantly struggling at such a point in time. Fifth, existing vulnerabilities. We cannot put mums in a monolith, right? It's not a monolithic category. It's not a homogeneous category. Mums are already vulnerable along lines of class, ability, race, are likely to be doubly and multiply impacted by the pandemic. And a great example here is Arfana, and it was one of my most heartbreaking and difficult interviews in this current set, because she was struggling just quite so much and was coping with such a huge amount of isolation and a huge amount of pressure that demonstrated these lines of difficulties where people who have existing vulnerabilities are going to suffer more. So Arfana's partner is supportive, but she's got enormous difficulties in terms of migration. So she tells me he's quite supportive, but he's got responsibilities, because of my visa conditions and the restrictions. He's got to work full time to meet the minimum income requirement, which is £18,600 a year, to I just used to cry, to be honest with you. I was stuck at home because with a new baby, I find it really hard to go out, especially when I don't drive and my husband goes. And she tells me later that her in-laws told her not to go out at all, even for a walk. And they blamed her if she would even think of going out with a baby amidst the lockdown in case the baby is infected. He's out for 12 hours, so he goes at 6 in the morning, comes back at 6 or 7. So for 12 hours, she's stuck at home. And there's that huge financial pressure on their family to meet the immigration restrictions. And finally, the virus itself stands to heighten maternal anxiety amidst a culture of risk management for infants where mothers are disproportionately burdened and blamed and made responsible for protecting children. And I've written about this kind of intensive mothering culture where moms are meant to do the absolute best and nothing but the best for their infants, often at their own expense and at the expense of their own mental health. And the context of a huge big virus going around makes that so much more felt for mums. And in this case, Irfana, who had a hugely difficult situation to handle for herself, was put under so much pressure by her in-laws to not even go out for a walk. And it was heartbreaking to hear in that interview that she has been sitting beside a window for 7 weeks and has not been able to step out of her house even once. And she was completely disconnected from the online. Nobody knew about this. Her GP didn't know. Her health visitor didn't know. She wasn't aware of the IAP services. She wasn't aware of any of the support services that could have at least given her a telephone line to talk to during the day when she was stuck at home with a baby. And when she spoke to me about her experiences of sitting beside a window day after day for 7 weeks with a tiny baby, it really brought home the disproportionate impacts of COVID-19. And the difficulties with assuming that the support we think reaches everybody just because it's online or just because it's digital. It doesn't. And there are many who are left behind. But there has been a rapid and urgent digital pivot, which has been so welcome. So many mums, for instance, talked about antenatal classes moving online, peer support groups meeting online, virtual coffees on Zooms, and how much they appreciated these things and how it was useful to have baby massage sessions online and just to show off babies to each other, babies who would normally have met at NCT cafe mornings. That didn't happen. Mums talked about formal support from GPs and health visitors, so health visitors making a call, perhaps on WhatsApp, to check in, to see how mums are doing, and that was really very welcome. Mums talked about existing forums, for instance, mothers forums and parenting and baby apps, communities on the apps that predate the pandemic, and existing telephone helplines like the NCT breastfeeding helpline that really, really helped. But much of the things that helped had been helping before, if you see what I mean. So much of the things that they said were helping, things like family Zoom calls or things like calling helplines, were things that were sort of already in place, which then made me think about what is it specifically about digital support in the pandemic that draws attention to things that could be improved. And perhaps some of these cannot be improved, and perhaps some of these can be improved, but not immediately. So it's quite nuanced there in terms of what technology can or cannot achieve. So Millie told me, for instance, nothing replaces a hug. Physical contact it's really important to me. I'm a touchy person, so that's really important. And that's the thing I'm really missing. It's what I'm really craving, especially from my mum, that's really tough. But it does soothe, I find, when you see somebody's face on video chat and you can see what they're doing, you can kind of imagine that you're there with them. And this concept of the video call being so important came up particularly in the context of health visiting. And numerous mums told me that it was so important to be able to hear their health visitor's voice, but to also see them, to show them the baby, to show them the baby's latch if breastfeeding, or to show them the baby if the baby is colicky. Or, as a mum told me, for them to see my face, to see if I'm upset. Seeing their face becomes so much important in a way that a telephone call or a WhatsApp message chain can't quite achieve. So there's something really worth thinking about there, about the concept of the hug. So if the hug cannot happen, and if physical contact cannot happen, then what can happen that might help? Leah told me that the midwives discharged me after 2 visits, but that's fairly common. The health visiting service has been really non-existent. This shows the disparity because in some of the cases, like I just said, health visitors were very much in contact and were very much kind of keeping in touch. But in other areas, mums told me that things had been non-existent. I had a phone call, and I think one phone call from them, I can't remember, probably on day 10, asked a couple of questions. I don't know, I felt they weren't really interested, which obviously is not the case, but perhaps the amount of cases on somebody's hands might make a difference there. And she says, I wasn't breastfeeding, but where would be the support? Because I was struggling. The reason I'm not breastfeeding is because I couldn't. But if I really wanted to keep going, she said, there's some online stuff. And I was like, well, that's not going to help me. And then other moms said, I couldn't breastfeed because I felt the support had run out. But perhaps if someone saw the latch on video, but then even if they saw the latch on video, another mom said a tongue tie was misdiagnosed because of the pixelation and the difficulty in broadband connection, all these things we assume, right? So that really takes us to a place where we have to think about not all remote support being the same. And there being these gradations in the kinds of remote support we can provide for things like feeding or things like emotional support or for well-being support. And the kinds of things we assume in terms of technology. So for instance, is there going to be high-speed broadband? Is there going to be pixelation? Can we do anything about a tongue tie remotely? So there always have to be limits, but it doesn't mean that we can't do things, that we can't achieve some things within those limits. So what are some of these uncertainties about that digital pivot I was talking about? First of all, inequalities in access, right? Technology does not always equally proportionately erase existing divides. I mean, there are people who are not connected. There are people who are entirely disconnected. There are people who are partly connected. The worst thing we can do is to assume that just because we've put something online, it reaches everybody. Second, there are inequalities in funding. I mean, the rapidity with which this digital pivot has happened from such a burden third sector, while so commendable, cannot be interpreted that these sectors are somehow not in need of urgent support. They need urgent support. They need extra funding for leadership and for training around this exact thing. If we are going to see that everybody, and that these kinds of nuances and complexities can be sort of ironed out for everybody. Third, there's a real risk in being techno-euphoric or sort of techno-solutionist, like technology is going to come in and solve everything for us. Because as we've seen from the examples I've just said, not all technology is the same. Not everybody has equal access. It can be really useful, for instance, that video call replacing the hug that I talked about. But sometimes certain things like tongue ties cannot always be helped through technological means. So it's about recognizing the limits and nuances of technology and understanding that just because something exists doesn't mean that it exists equally for everybody out there in their very different contexts. So Arfana's context, as I pointed out, where she was stuck in front of a window for 7 weeks and nobody knew, to somebody who's actively accessing health visitor support by video, but struggling with things like pixelation and tongue ties and feeding, there's so much disparity. So we need to move away from techno-euphoria and techno-solutionism. And of course, there's the question of this sense of urgency and designing these urgent solutions, brushing away concerns about digital rights. I mean, a few of the moms talked about children's data and babies' data. Where does the data go if everything becomes digital? The question of privacy. Somebody's parents wanted to install a webcam into their room to see them all the time, all the day, the baby sleeping. And she's conflicted between wanting that kind of contact and not wanting that kind of contact as well. So these are not long-standing concerns about digital platforms that we need to be extra mindful about, perhaps, because things are so urgent right now and it's so easy to lose sight of these things. So what works? From a position of somebody who has not analyzed their data yet, who has not even seen the transcripts fully yet, it seems from listening to mothers that what seems to work is more extensive follow-up that is tailored and targeted of vulnerable people. Arfana should be spotted by someone. Someone should find out that Arfana hasn't left her house in 7 weeks, that she's under significant financial pressure, relationship pressure. Somebody needs to find out from the person who's stuck at home self-isolating with a partner away all day and at all times, struggling on their own, absolutely alone. So more extensive follow-up of vulnerable people, those who are disconnected, those who are coping with existing difficulties, and who are now doubly burdened. Tailored follow-up of those in difficult relationships, those coping with self-isolation. Video calling for things such as feeding, but also for mom to see someone's face and for someone to see her face and the look in her eyes. That can't be done by texting or by phone calls. For any digital support, for the support provider to not assume there's privacy at home. And I say this to anybody, to formal support providers, but also informally, friends and family, don't assume privacy at home. Ask if it's possible to speak privately or even by email, to give the person an opportunity to communicate. To actively support those who are in the very early weeks after giving birth, those who are in the full throes of the, waking multiple times a night, never sleeping, constantly arguing, that kind of a phase, and locked down, and facing a pandemic. And to ensure that the wide array of digital services are sort of joined up, that healthcare professionals across sectors know what exists, know what's being done, and are aware of the limits of what's being done, and are aware that just because something exists, it's not going to reach everybody equally. And that this joined up thinking happens, and so that mums are met by people, virtually even, who are aware of everything that exists and can recommend tailored things, because not everything might suit everybody. Not everybody wants to join the mush group. The mush group, if it's too non-local, might not work for everybody. Not every app works for everybody. That kind of training, that kind of awareness is really key for healthcare professionals in particular, to kind of face the demands and challenges of this pandemic, and to remember above everything that mums are not a monolithic category, and targeted and tailored approaches are needed, so that we can spot our orphanas, so that we can spot who needs that extra support, and to be able to provide that. So both digital support services are so diverse, and these nuances exist between audio and video and this app or that forum, but also the diversity in contexts and access. And it's those things, I think, that we need to bear in mind, away from techno euphoria and techno sedationism, towards seeing that we can work through this pandemic and counter and mitigate some of the effects on the perinatal by using technology with that sort of nuanced hat on our heads, nuanced thinking going on there about what might work and what might not work, and recognizing sometimes that technology might not be enough after all. Thank you.